So I'm just going to lower the volume a tiny bit here. We have sort of a big day of Rhino stuff today. I hope everybody had a really nice weekend. It was fantastic weather out there this weekend, like really great for fall colors. Anybody have any questions before we sort of jump off into Rhino land? I know some of you are probably still working on getting finished up with the remix video assignment. Yay. And so just to sort of recap where we've been with Rhino, we are in week 8 right now. And we are going to, no, we're not. We're in week 9. There we go. And so today, I'm going to be talking to you, guess what, about Rhino. We're going to be doing some different techniques. We're also going to be kind of maybe taking a step back and looking at Rhino as like kind of a big picture thing, how it compares to other 3D modelers, what are some of the technologies that Rhino has that other things don't have. And then also you can see that there's an assignment being introduced here. So there are 3 Rhino assignments. One is a so-called mini assignment, meaning that it's a sort of small, kind of compressed assignment with not a lot of conceptual overhead to bog you down. And that is the modules assignment that I'm referring to. And then the impossible object assignment, I do want to just say a couple of things about the impossible object assignment. Some people get hung up on whether on this part, which is to model an object that would be impossible to make by today's standards. If I said that, maybe it was impossible to make this phone like 30 years ago, you probably would have said, yes, that is clearly impossible and totally insane. How could you ever suggest such a thing? So it's more just really that it's like in the spirit of being impossible or kind of difficult or something out of the ordinary. I'm not going to interview a bunch of manufacturers to sort of assess whether your invention is truly impossible or not. So don't get hung up on that, please. It's more of just like a kind of an inspiration thing. And as you can see, it's sort of like in the realm of fantasy, right? So as far as scale, this actually is kind of a decent way of defining scale in Rhino because it is really sort of what dictates which template you're starting with. So if your object is larger than a coffee mug and smaller than a house, you are probably going to start with the small objects template. You don't have to, but that's just sort of like a pro tip. For these, pretty much all of the future assignments, you could use the small objects template. And so you may also notice that there are no sort of guidelines in this assignment about rendering, colors, kind of like visual appearance layers. That's because we haven't covered any of that stuff yet, and I'm not expecting you to integrate that into your assignment. So you may happen to see examples that are like fully rendered and really beautifully colored. Those are people that did what I call going the extra mile, which is a phenomenon that you may have heard of. So you're absolutely not required to do any of that for the assignment. Those are just sort of like inspiration picks. So that being said, I kind of think we can probably jump into thinking about Rhino. And we're going to think about Rhino in a somewhat more broader way. We're going to sort of like, maybe today is a little bit like a pit stop before we get going through this sort of like almost 6 sessions, well, at least 4 sessions of building up an environment with lighting and everything like that. So today we're going to kind of take a step back and we're going to sort of just look at the idea of a 3D modeler, what it does, also some sort of like technical distinctions that are really important moving forward. So what we're working with when we work with Rhino is a thing called NURBS. NURBS sounds sort of like the kind of thing that my cat does when he's like, that's not a NURB. A NURB is a non-uniform rational B-spline. So that's basically like down here in this slide. It's basically like a mathematical way of describing the curve that results from points surrounded by the curve. Now, the cool thing about NURBS that you probably don't know and probably would never need to know is that historically, NURBS actually came into being as a technology based on shipbuilding and woodworking. So it's a little bit maybe kind of interesting to think about that. So what do I mean by woodworking? Well, like if I'm a beam of wood and I put like a post here, then that beam of wood has something to bend around, basically, right? So the beam of wood starts to sort of fit onto this little thing. And then in digital form, these become called anchor points. And these are the points that sort of hold the piece together while you're deforming it into a curve. So we have not really looked at curve tools in Rhino, so it might not be immediately obvious to you that Rhino works fundamentally in NURBS. It just so happens that most of the NURBS that we've used, like on Thursday in class, those were all NURBS that happened to be straight lines with just 2 points between them. So as we move forward, we're going to be engaging more with the sort of NURBS aspect of Rhino. And as I said before, NURBS are non-uniform rational B-splines. And pretty much, as far as Rhino goes, they're kind of the main event in Rhino. They're like the entree. You have some side dishes in Rhino. You have a little bit of mesh. So those are polygon modeling. So most 3D apps now, because we're way into the sort of advanced phase of 3D technology, most 3D apps contain multiple methods for making a form. So NURBS really is just kind of like this underlying architecture, and it is the underlying architecture of Rhino. But just like most other software programs, Rhino has been kind of pressured to incorporate other models. And so some of those other models are things that we're going to talk about here. So polygonal modeling, and that's something that we're going to actively sort of produce today. Polygonal modeling is something that if you're working towards animation or especially real-time rendering through games or virtual environments, polygonal modeling is kind of like the way. Now, that is sort of like just a way to make the actual thing, right? Does that mean that maybe you can't take a NURBS object and make it into a polygon object? Yeah, we're totally going to do that later today. So there's polygonal modeling, and the main advantage to polygonal modeling is that it tends to produce models that are very fast. So it's fast for computers to preview them and sort of move them around. It's also fast to perform operations on them. So if you're looking for a model that performs at like 120 frames a second, you're definitely looking for a polygon model. And the other place where polygon models come in is actually in 3D printing. So any 3D print is generally coming from a polygonal model. There's another thing called surface subdivision modeling, which is super exotic, and most software programs only use subdivision modeling as a plugin. And then there's one other type of sort of schema that gets connected to 3D geometry in these different software programs, and that is constructive solid geometry. So constructive solid geometry is like if you could imagine saying, I want box. And box is 20 wide by 20 high, and maybe box has like a little blue hat on it. And so you go into your model and you say, hey, I want 100 more boxes, but instead of blue hats, I want them to have red hats. And you can kind of do that globally with the push of a button. So that's the kind of affordances that constructive solid geometry gives you. It doesn't necessarily produce better or more interesting models. It's really more just like a technical distinction. So places where you would see constructive solid geometry would include like Autodesk applications, pretty much any Autodesk application that works off of old school AutoCAD architecture. So like Inventor, AutoCAD, OpenSCAD is another one. And so these are just things that, do you kind of have to know them? I mean, I don't know. I don't have to know like what time to wake up in the morning, but I do anyway. So I would say, yeah, it's good to know because you might encounter them at some point later on in your career, and you can be like, aha, that's that. Particularly, I think the distinction that we're interested in is this distinction between polygonal modeling and NURBS modeling. So just to give you kind of a better idea of what a NURB surface looks like, of course, this is a NURB in one dimension, well, technically two. So this is a two-dimensional NURB, otherwise known as a curve, or a curved segment. And then this is when you would get into like a three-dimensional NURB. And one of the things that's really cool about NURBS is that it comes with all of these sort of control points. And you can adjust this, and it stays malleable until you're totally done, which is awesome. So if we're thinking about this idea of NURBS versus polygons, why do we care about NURBS? What are NURBS good for? Well, as you can see, they're really good for curved surfaces. If we have a polygon and we try to make a curved surface with polygons, what is that going to look like? Well, I'm just going to run over to the board and I'm going to just draw a picture of a circle for those of you watching the video at home. So there's the sort of NURBS version. And don't worry, people at home, we'll do this on screen too. And then this would be like the polygonal version, my expert art handling. So what we have basically is a circle, and then we have an octagon. And you can say, sure, that octagon is an approximation of the circle, right? Yeah, okay. Is it the circle? Absolutely not. So it's just something to keep in mind. Like if you're designing something in Rhino and you're making it in NURBS, maybe you want to have something right at this point. It's good to know because if you go into, let's say maybe that point is actually right here when you convert it to polygons, things get sort of lopped off, right, and generalized in this process of converting from NURBS to polygons. So some people make the sort of distinction or make the assertion that NURBS versus polygons is a little bit like JPEGs versus TIFFs. And I would say, maybe. It's not exactly the same because with JPEG, it's sort of a compression algorithm that's coming in to sort of make your data more generalized. And with NURBS, it's a little bit more straightforward, actually. So again, why would we want to use polygons versus NURBS? Definitely polygons have a lot more speed in rendering. If you make a 3D scan or buy a 3D scan, I can almost guarantee that that will be in a polygon mesh. And then again, they're also a final format for 3D printing. So I'm going to just show you this for real. We're going to kind of mush through this in Rhino, but I did want to include, a slide in the slide deck. And so basically, we're going to work through this hierarchy. We're going to make a point, we're going to make a line, we're going to make a surface, an open polysurface, a closed polysurface. So this is basically, in a nutshell, like the hierarchy of NURBS forms and the different types of NURBS forms that you can have in Rhino. So we'll kind of work through it in a slightly different way that might be a little more NURBY. Love that word. It's totally not a word, by the way. You can make it one. I support NURBY as a word. So if we wanted to make something a little bit more NURBY here, we've played around with the solid components, right? So here's the box, and there's this whole menu of stuff that you can kind of get to. We're not going to deal with, as far as I can tell, we're not going to deal with any of that stuff today. We're going to make a form from scratch in Rhino. And to make a form in Rhino, well, you can see back on our slide here that we basically have, okay, we probably want to start with a line and then go to a surface. And so let's go ahead and do that. Instead of a straight line, though, I'm going to use a curvy line. And I'm going to use, let me cancel out of this just so you can see fully. I'm going to actually use this control point curve function right here. And in this control point curve, I'm just going to go ahead and enable that. And I'm just going to click on some points. And probably, I'm in the top view right now. I'm going to switch to the front view real quickly, just so that I'm basically going to make a vase. And I wanted to make it from a side, right? I don't want to draw the side of the vase in the top view. So I want to do that like in the front or the right. So I'm going to go ahead and make kind of a vasey-like line. And we can kind of just leave it like that if we want. And so now I'm sort of up to the second point of the hierarchy, which is that I've made a line, right? Woo! It's a NURB. So that's great. So what am I going to do with this line? Well, I think it would be really cool if we took the line. Oh, by the way, it has control points that you can edit. You don't get those with polygons. And so from here, if I want to basically take this form and kind of make it into a vase, like it's like I'll be basically like conceptually spinning it. So I would go ahead and use the surface menu. So these menus in Rhino are really organized, not so much in terms of like, I have a surface and I want to do something with it. It's more like, I have something and I want to get a surface out of it. So pretty much all of these menus, solid, mesh, most of them assume that the solid or the surface is actually what you want as the result, not necessarily that you're coming in with a surface and wanting to do something with it. So let's go ahead and say, I'll try this revolve method. We're going to spend a lot of time, over here in the surface menu, this revolve. We're going to spend a lot of time in the curve, surface, solid, and probably transform menus in this class. So just don't get freaked out, please. We're going to just go through it step by step. It's a lot. So starting here, we want to make a form in the surface menu. We want to take this curve, and we want to spin it around to make a sort of vase shape. So let's do revolve. And then it says select curve to revolve. Okie dokie. Hit enter. Yep. Start of axis. So literally, when they say axis, they mean like the local axis of the shape. So if this is my shape, I could have that the axis on which the shape turns. Traditionally, that's in the middle, right, of the shape. So wherever I put that axis, if it's up and down from a side view or the front view, that is going to sort of be like a sort of pin that's running through the center of my object. I'll just show you a couple of different variations after we get through this. So it's basically 2 points. You click a bottom point and a top point. And then from there, you can start to actually kind of play around with it interactively with the mouse. But I'm just going to kind of short circuit that process and tell it that it needs to be full circle. And now you can see I have a surface. Does it look like a surface right now? It does not, because I need to shift the rendering mode of the perspective view. So I double pressed or right click, and you should be able to change the rendering mode right here. And so this is what's called a surface in Rhino. And how do you know it's a surface? Well, that's a good question. Probably if we click on it, you can see down here, we get a nice report that says one open surface has been added to the selection. It's kind of good to know that it's open. Just sort of abstractly as a shape, would this be 3D printable right now? Anybody? No, it is not 3D printable. Why is it not 3D printable? Well, this surface at this point is really just kind of an abstraction. It doesn't have any thickness. So a surface that just has one wall is like, it's like a picture of a piece of paper, right? It doesn't really exist. If you take this and we were to maybe put a surface on top and surface on bottom by using this really easy method called solid cap planar holes, now we're getting into territory where this is now, a couple of things have happened. We've capped those holes, which is like really easy and really great. What have we created here? Well, if I select this, it should be a poly surface. And as you can see, it grabbed the curve and it grabbed the poly surface. So poly surface is just a fancy pseudoscientific way of saying it's got more than one surface. It's sort of like sounds a lot fancier than it really is. So you could literally just take two surfaces that are completely outside of each other and select them both, and it would recognize that as a poly surface. So basically, here now we have this sort of like solid closed poly surface. How do you know if it's a closed poly surface? If it doesn't say otherwise, it's probably closed. So if it says that it's open, then obviously that's an idea that it's open. Does it matter if it's closed or open? Yeah, it'll matter later. So in any case, right now, we've sort of got a plausible-looking vasey object. If I wanted to take this a step further, I guess, and sort of think about ways to make it more exciting, probably if I were making a real object, I could go ahead and hollow it out. And that would be a good way to kind of show you just how to, construct a hollow form. So we have to do that eventually anyway. So let's go ahead and just really quickly, I'm going to use the shell command. And what that does is it takes a closed poly surface, which we happen to have, and it takes that closed poly surface, it assigns a wall thickness, and then it resolves the top and bottom edges. Super awesome. So select faces to remove from closed poly surface. Well, I don't know about you, but I would like my vase to open at the top. So I think I'm going to leave the top, remove the top. And it looks like that failed, and for a reason that I can tell you why really quickly. So the reason that it failed, and this is just a good sort of like reality check, if we look at our units right here, it looks like the, so we're basically like 4 of these grid points are 1 inch. So if we're asking this thing to have a wall thickness of 1 inch, I'm sure you can understand that that might be somewhat problematic, because it basically just is like, I can't go anywhere, I can't do anything. So let's make that parameter like a lot smaller, like maybe, I don't know, maybe 1.125. And now we select that top face, and we get a very different result. So this is really the way that it's supposed to look. And you can see here now we've got a little bit of sort of svelteness going on in our form, but we could, as it's in NURBS right now, we could do pretty much any transformation that we wanted to. We could make it squat by scaling it. We could twist it. There's a lot of things that we could do. Once you take a form out of NURBS by converting it into polygons, there's really like no going back. And maybe like if you converted a cube, it would go back because it's so simple, it kind of can't fail. But trust me, anything you care about, it will not do a good job on it. So why would we even want to convert this to polygons? Well, the main reason that we would convert it to polygons is, well, for a couple of reasons. One would be if we want to actually 3D print it. So let me show you real quickly. I'll go into the mesh. And this is a slightly more complicated process than you would use if you were just making a 3D print. I'm doing this going into the mesh menu just to kind of illustrate the point that I am trying to make. So if we go to mesh from NURBS object, you can see here we can hit preview, and we can have a very different sort of conversation. So this right now looks a really far cry away from my sort of octagon and circle example, right? But if we take this, hi, I see you. If we take this and we throw this back here and preview it again, you can see that there is such a thing as too few polygons. Yes? To close it, that was under the solid menu, is cap planar holes. Yep. And so here you can see we have it set to have very few polygons, which is kind of okay, but you can sort of see what happens here. If I just pull the mesh out, one of these does not look like the others, right? So what's happened is that in the conversion process, we have basically kind of maybe overdone it. In some universes, this sort of severely limited model would be actually better, right? So if you're making something for a game context and you're looking for a low poly model, you might actually want to throttle back on the polygons a lot because it's going to give you a much smaller file that can be rendered more quickly. For 3D printing, I generally do the opposite. For 3D printing, I generally take the mesh and make it like at least mostly fine. So here you can see that we've generated a mesh now. And this mesh will, when it's 3D printed, pretty much be indistinguishable from the original NURBS copy. Yes? Yeah, that's a really good question. So the question was, if not everybody heard it, do you have to model your own support structure? I would say no. Pretty much all of the 3D printing software that we use, and definitely professional service bureaus, use software that generates the supports automatically, because you don't necessarily know as the designer or as the artist like what direction the printer is in, right? And so in other words, to design the supports for a model, like you'd have to know that, right? Another thing that you might think about, I mean, there is one time I printed a head of somebody that was scanned, and I wanted there to be like a very minimal sort of cone supporting the chin. And so I actually threw that in myself, but that's like just because I was being really picky. That's like out of like probably 1,000 models that we've done, so it's a very rare occurrence. Any other questions as we kind of move on? So now that we've had a little bit of this conversation about low poly, high poly, it's something that you may decide to use it in the class if you decide to do the 3D print for extra credit. But this is really just sort of like general information that is pretty sort of like critical to if you ever want to do anything, you know, at any further point with 3D stuff. So we have these three versions of our object, and probably I think this version would be the greatest version for 3D printing. But typically what I do when I 3D print is I just select the NURBS object, and there's an exporter that will actually show you the polygon conversion kind of as you export it. So I just scroll down here to STL. The STL file format is the preferable file format for 3D printing. And then go to Options, and then Export, and then after all that, it kicks a window where you can kind of adjust the polygons. So you don't get this awesome interface where you can just sweep between fewer and more polygons. It's a little more technical. So you have to hit the preview button, and then it will sort of show you what the mesh looks like. So right now, our tolerance, in other words, the fidelity with which it's capturing the NURBS object, that tolerance is like 0.001. That's, yeah, it's a thousandth of an inch. If your 3D printer can hold a thousandth of an inch, I applaud you. You win a prize. That seems like, honestly, like kind of overkill for an object of this importance. So I would just try it maybe at 100th. That's still plenty fine, but it's going to give you just sort of like a much more reasonable looking mesh. Why would you not want to export your mesh at a thousandth of an inch? Well, I'll tell you, one time I worked with this guy who had a model of a car, and every single part in the car was articulated. It was almost fully articulated inside. And he wanted to print it out at a thousandth of an inch accuracy. And the actual file was like almost like 5 gigabytes. And basically, trying to be kind, but also like, somewhat stunned, I basically said, yeah, no, like we can't, nobody can process a file like that. So with 3D files, like if you get 3D files that start creeping into the 200 to 300 megabyte range, I would, even for 3D prints, I would consider maybe like at that point you need to have a conversation with your Rhino and maybe pull that slider back a little more and give yourself some chunkier polygons. So okay, so then basically you would hit OK, and then you have a fully ready file to use. So thinking about sort of NURBS and the hierarchy and all that, we can start kind of jumping into, I'm going to sort of do surface construction methods. So as you may have noticed in the last sort of thing that we did, one of the main ways that we construct things is actually through this sort of hierarchy. So in other words, you draw a line. I'm just going to demonstrate once more. I'm going to draw a line there. And then I can go to surface, and I can say something like maybe extrude curve straight. So there's my curve to extrude. I'm basically extruding it straight on. Here's a question. So this is probably has or will happen to you. If you notice in the top view right now where I created that line, it looks like the extrusion is actually kind of working in the other viewport. In other words, it's going over down here, right? When I actually want to shoosh it this way. It's a super common problem in Rhino. It basically means that the last time I used this tool, I used it differently. And Rhino remembered that helpfully for me. So basically, all we have to do is click this direction button, and then you can set the direction for any Rhino tool. So in this case, I want it to go this way, literally like from here to here, or vice versa. And now it's sort of obeying my command, as you should, Surface. And so here is now, wow, a rectangle. So what's the sort of exciting thing there? Well, not much. We're going to kind of get to maybe try some other things with this rectangle. And one of them would be, from the front view, I think I'm going to draw a curve. So as we kind of get this to a place where it's moving from rectangle to solid, sometimes with Rhino, I think one of the things that's a little bit confusing for people is that it really pays to make forms in Rhino using sort of some of these construction methods. The solid menu that we used earlier, you can do a lot with just moving around solids, right, and stacking up solids. But at some point, you kind of have to get into the meat and potatoes of Rhino, which are these sort of curve surface creation tools and solid creation tools. So one thing that you'll find yourself doing an awful lot in Rhino is sort of making things out of other things. Example, I just drew this little curve that's perpendicular to the surface that I just made. And I'm basically going to take this surface, and I'm going to take the surface and iterate it on the curve. So that's kind of like a very classic thing that Rhino likes to do. And I'll show you how. We're going to go to Extrude Curve Along Curve, and select Curves to Extrude. In this case, we want all of the curves that are part of this box. And we might talk about the selection, and then select Path Curve Near Start, and then it just kind of auto-generates it, right? So it's basically what you would get if you imagined sort of, taking that thing and just replicating it along that curve. So many more random things to show you. We did look at the revolve command. Let's go ahead and just revisit that for one quick second. So I'm going to make another vase-like form and push it out like that. Just a couple of things about vectors and NURBS in Rhino. Pretty much as long as you see these points, you can get in there and adjust them. So one thing that I've noticed is that people who are new to some of the tools, particularly the control point curve tool, it can be kind of stressful to figure out where all of those points go. Like if I draw the control point curve here, it takes some getting used to. And some people are just it takes a while to get used to that, right? Like where the points go versus relative to the line that's generated. So my advice to most people who are new in Rhino is just go ahead and click those points down, because you can always reform them later. If you're ever feeling like you have sort of sense of pressure, not necessary. So if we take this object and go ahead and revolve it again. So again, start of revolve axis would be somewhere up here, somewhere down here. I'm going to go for that full circle thing. And that's great. So I'm just going to move this over here. And I'm just going to show you, if we do decide to move that axis, what happens. It will generate a different form. So if we go to revolve here, we can select this curve. Thank you very much. And then we can revolve. I'm actually going to open the revolve axis in the middle of the form itself, which is a little crazy. That's OK. And then I'm going to full circle it. And as you can see, you get an extremely different result, right? So when you move that axis around, you can kind of get some really exciting results. Also, the axis, not to sort of make things unnecessarily complicated, but that axis can also be not straight. So, well, in other words, it has to be straight. It can be non-perpendicular. So right now we have it set up so that it's perpendicular to the rotation. We could also set it up so that it's like that. And it's going to generate something very different. So it's just kind of like worth noting maybe that this one function, generated these 3 or 4 radically different forms, right? Just by kind of moving around where that rotation point goes. There are also other exciting ways of making form. So another way of making form that I really like is to, I'm just going to make sort of like a random curve here. I'm basically doodling at this point in an exploratory way. When we have class on Thursday, we're actually going to start building a scene. So we're going to be working towards like a solid goal. Like right now, I'm basically just showing you how to do stuff. So we have this sort of arc here. It's really just a control point curve. I'm going to give myself some room to kind of get it out of the way here. And well, we could certainly revolve this. We could probably do some other things with it. If I take another curve and make it perpendicular to this curve in some way, this would actually be a wonderful place to make sure my object snaps are on, because I want to make sure that that point hits that point. And so we can go ahead and just make that curve, and then I can go ahead in here and maybe make it go in a totally different direction. So basically, we could use this sort of either revolve along or extrude curve along curve. We've kind of already done that, but it would look very different. Another thing that you could do here is to go ahead and add a curve. So I'm going to just cut and paste this curve and maybe stick it over here. It's not quite how I imagined it to be, but it'll do. And then we could basically come in here and use the edge curves method. And so the edge curves method asks to basically identify, 2, 3, or 4 curves that are plausibly near each other that could maybe hold a curve. And so that's how you wind up getting stuff like that. And it basically what it is like a totally free-form curve object. Now, do you really have to model with free-form curve objects? No, not really. It depends on what you're modeling, right? I mean, if you're modeling like jewelry, boats, products, most products that we have today are, pretty curvy. So yeah, product design, I would say, definitely falls into that. You might not need to have something, quite so curvy if you're modeling like a sort of dystopic industrial hellscape, for example. No curves in there, maybe. So whether you decide that you really like the curve functions in Rhino, it doesn't bother me if you like them or dislike them. I mean, just lean into them if you like them, and if you don't like them, then, use rectangles. It's a time-honored process. So I think probably that's like mostly what I wanted to cover today. I have a couple of seconds if anybody has any additional questions. So starting tomorrow, we are going to sort of work through a fully rendered kind of scene. We're going to build an environment. We're going to fill it with stuff that we make, and then we're going to light it, and then we're going to render it. Any other questions? Cool. All right. Well, it's been great. I'll see you all on Thursday. Feel free to do the emails if you have any questions. Thanks, everyone.